Yeah, so I'm Pixie. I use they them pronouns. I'm the director of the California Homeless Youth Project, which is a project that's nested in the California Research Bureau, which is in the state library. I'm also a person with lived expertise of homelessness as a young person, and also again during COVID. I'm also a social worker. I did wraparound services. I also created and ran 3 housing programs for LGBT youth here in Sacramento, and now I do data and policy. So whoever it was who was like, "Oh, people don't think data is nice," I'm like, I love data, which you'll see, and I nerd out on data. So that's me. So one of the foundations that we're going to go through our presentation is, I think a lot of us have maybe heard, right, implicit biases, right? But what we're going to have as an undercurrent is implicit assumptions, right? Where maybe logically, professionally, and intellectually we know better, but there's this undercurrent of an implicit assumption that informs how we navigate with one another or understand what we're seeing. So the first one. Okay. Assumption 1, unaccompanied youth under 18 are supported by the foster care system. Right. Actually, there are 8,700 unaccompanied minors experiencing homelessness and less than 450 beds to support them. And so the actual number is 431 beds. And if folks don't know, like Margaret said, we're with the McKinney-Vento definition, which actually is more encompassing to cover couch surfing and living in a hotel motel. But this number, the 8,700, is actually what is included in the HUD, Housing and Urban Development definition, which is actually the most restrictive. So that number is a lot larger. So again, 430 beds. Assumption 2. Foster care and youth homelessness systems receive plenty of funding. No? And again, right, we know this. However, and again, transparency, I only got to come today, but as I'm hearing collaboration, and that's also gonna be something we talk about, I hear about policies, and if we don't have funding to connect us, to use to collaborate, to use to leverage, it doesn't matter what we do, because unfortunately in this system, we need money. So if you, again, data nerd, so it takes about $29,000 to raise a child every year in California. Each year, for each child. So looking at the numbers of youth in foster care and the numbers of youth experiencing homelessness and the funding that's allocated to each system, nerding, here we go, is that there is only enough funding to support each foster youth for 3 months out of the year, and every youth experiencing homelessness for 12 days, right? It's not enough, right? And yes, there's a big disparity between youth homelessness and foster youth. However, 3 months still isn't the whole year, right? That's 9 months that they're having to navigate with not enough resources, and we are those resources too, right? So this is where I situate a lot of my work. But our positions give us subject matter expertise of our services, systems, and gaps, right? I see very often that a lot of evaluations will come down, or we do these like look-ins about our programs, our work, but it's from our perspective, right? Youth and the clients that we serve are the experts, right? And I even said that I'm a person with lived expertise of homelessness, and I'm not currently experiencing homelessness. So I still don't situate in that I know what's going on right now. And again, I loved the intellectual humility. I really, really appreciated that. I'm gonna leverage that a bit and talk about adultism. Can I just have a raise of hands of who's heard of the word adultism? Okay, all right, I'm here for it. I love it. So adultism is kind of the opposite of ageism on the other side of the spectrum, that we undervalue or do not take seriously the perspectives and beliefs and recommendations from young people because of their age. But I also want to talk about how that's projected into our work, right? Us, is that we see that in as us, as professionals, that I will admit I did not know this was a plenary session, and so I got some big imposter syndrome feels when I found out I had to be up here in front of you all. That if you are newer to a job, right? If you don't have 20 years of experience, your perspective, your opinion, and what you bring to the table is less valuable or less aligned, right? So that's still, when we don't address that, it comes into our work, right? And the other piece that's important to think about this is I've heard, again, social worker, we're the boots on the ground, right? And that's important, and it situates us in the idea that we're yes, front lines, but that we've got the most hits, right? We're most impacted. But I want to change the narrative and think about that young people and the clients that we serve are bare feet on the ground. So we at least have protection with boots. We have the mindset that we're ready to kick some doors down or some other things. They're bare feet, right? So last one, and then I'll hand it over, well, for now, I hand it over to Margaret. So the California Department of Education is resourced to address student homelessness. There are only 1,800 liaisons to serve the over 247,000 students experiencing homelessness. That is a ratio of 1 for every 137 students. However, caveat, that this number, the 1,800 liaisons, includes liaisons that are also principals or superintendents or school social workers. And research showed that on average, these liaisons spent 8 hours a week on homelessness services. We can't make a difference with 8 hours a week. So in areas that actually had McKinney-Vento liaisons, that was their sole job, their caseloads averaged 1,500 students. Even if you gave did 10 students a day, you still couldn't get through everyone in the year. So I know, all the heavy stuff, you're welcome. So what do we do about that? And that's actually how we got started.
So 2 of those liaisons in San Diego and LA called me 2.5 years ago and said, what would it take for you to lead a statewide effort to get real funding? Because what happened prior to the pandemic is we had literally a quarter of the kids experiencing homelessness in the country, and the federal government gave us $13 million. $6 million went to county offices of ed, which means there are roughly 10 people in the entire state in county offices of ed who get this as their full-time job, which means in LA County, that person gets 20 cents per kid to identify and serve. So it's shocking that there was a California audit where the headline in the Sacramento Bee the next day was, California fails to identify, much less serve, its homeless population. And having talked to a lot of folks in the nods this morning, it feels like a ton of people might be wearing the McKinney and Foster hat or have started there. And there might be folks on the healthcare side that then rely on education to know who these kids are. And we also want to reveal that's not true. And it's not true because there's no money to do it. 45 school districts in the entire state of California received any money prior to COVID to count. And most school districts will tell you, so I have 8 hours, 4 hours a week to count. So what is the point? What am I going to get for it? 7% of our LCAPs, the learning plans, even name this population, even though it's one of the 4 groups. And less than 1% of LCAP dollars go there. So for teachers, for administrators, there's no money in counting. They know they're not going to get anything, and they will flatly say, I know who my foster kids are because there's a little bit of money. I really don't know who my homeless kids are. And under local control, we give most of the money to the counties, but the counties don't get the data in real time. So they can have whole districts that just forget to send out the housing questionnaire and report 0 kids, which 30% of our school districts in California did prior to the pandemic. And the people that are supposed to provide technical assistance won't know that for an entire year until they get the data for their districts from the state. So when I got the call, we had run a very successful program in Monterey County. We had improved graduation rates by 13%, and our entire population of McKinney-Vento students doubled because it's the pandemic. So we had that practice sort of inform policy. There had been a coalition around some of these bills. So they came and said, what would it take for a nickel? And thinking about Pixie and all of the people that I met, you just have to sit with, I'm not the right person. I have half the assumptions she just put on the wall, and I'm supposed to be in charge. This is not going to work. So I ended up asking everybody to be on a subcommittee. We had a youth subcommittee. We had county offices to do implementation. And I thought, we'll meet quarterly. What was hilarious is the data subcommittee, as anybody who loves data, these people were so excited to be together and talk about data. They're like, let's meet monthly. And it just took off, like, to use an old Irish saying, a house on fire. So the reason I got the call when I did is because under the American Rescue Plan, California got roughly $99 million. So for the first time, there was real money. So over the pandemic, even though California lost 6.7% of their student population, McKinney-Vento identification went up 9%. So finally, we went from 45 to 327 districts being incentivized to at least care to count. We are back at 73 because that money has gone away. So LA and San Diego are saying we've set up these programs, we've been able to staff up, we've created hotel vouchers and programs, we're seeing real outcomes, and it's all gonna go away. What can we do to sort of stop the bleeding? And at that point, I talked to everybody that had ever written a report on this, from Stanford and UCSF and LPI, and Pixie's only one of the state person who runs the data system. All of us met and just started talking about where the data gaps were. But I also realized at a certain point, we are an advocacy organization that runs by an advocacy calendar. And what you all have proved in this room is this takes years of being in rooms like this and having county partnerships. We should not be leading this. Everyone that I begged to join a subcommittee had to get permission from their boss to do it because we're an advocacy organization. It needed to be neutral. It needed to be steeped in the data. Somebody said yesterday, we should all be here just trying to get to the best next question. And that was not going to be us. And at that point, everyone had told me throughout this process, have you met Deb McKoy? You guys are gonna get along. She's got all these amazing students. And Deb has spent her entire life at the intersections of all the systems we're talking about. She literally brings education and city planning and housing and transportation together at Berkeley. And so I begged her to take this on, and she did, and she is our next speaker.
Thank you, Margaret. It's wonderful to be here. I've learned so much over the last couple of days. I'm a newcomer, and I wasn't quite sure if I fit in. I'm not really a mental health person. Thank you. Teamwork. Is that good? All right, I'm a teacher first. All right, good. You know, and I've spent time, of course, it's a critical part of our work, but I talk a lot about city infrastructure and learning systems. But coming in yesterday and hearing the opening and the commitment to young people, I never felt more at home, because that is where we are grounded. That's where we are humbled, when we actually listen to the lived experience and expertise of the young people whose systems we're trying to make work. So thank you so much. It's been an incredible learning experience over these last couple of years. I also want to really recognize the young leaders who you met in the video this morning, Shelby, Lucy, Jacine, and Isaiah, who played an incredibly powerful role, continues to play a role in our work, and the committee really helping us understand the day-to-day lived experience that we also call data in the academic circles. What happened out of the data was realizing that we had to get past our geeky monthly conversations, which we loved because we had this we all were very different, right? Ranging from policy advocates and lawyers to faculty to a young man, Anthony, who was on the committee, who was a law student who formerly was homeless for 13 years, right? So the committee, we knew we needed to break out and expand the connections, so we decided to have a convening. And we had a first convening at Berkeley called a Learning Exchange, and this past September, we had an action exchange, bringing together, over 125 different folks from different sectors. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about this action exchange, and the work in data collection and sharing that led up to it. I'm also going to talk about how this work really challenges our fifth assumption, right? That collaboration to break silos is simply communication, right? As Margaret shared, what is so important about this work, right, is that we bring folks together who recognize that cross-sector, cross-geography, cross-disciplinary collaboration is essential to sustaining progress. But one of the key lessons that we learned together over these 2 years is the difference between what we call critical collaboration versus a group meeting, where people come together, give a little update, share what's going on, without really reflecting critically and humbly about what that means. What is the data? What do the insights mean? And so critical collaboration is recognizing that each of us came to this work with a personal drive and need to understand others' perspectives and data, as well as a shared commitment and passion, if you will, for better understanding the big picture. How the sum of each of our parts impacted and influenced statewide data and policy for students experiencing homelessness across California. Many of us brought a more qualitative perspective, such as our work at the center, where we really ground the research in youth-led research and analysis over the past few years, working specifically with the California Department of Education and regional centers set up to help allocate this $100 million in unique funding. So at the beginning of the story map, and if you don't know it, it's a publicly accessible website kind of prototype where you can use it to really tell a story about phenomenon and work. And so we find we're using these story maps more and more. Very accessible websites. So at the beginning here, you'll see two familiar faces, Isaiah and Shelby, who are in the video. Next to Isaiah is a wonderful woman, Daisha, who came from LA, and she represented foster care experience, which was really important for the panel discussion. I will also say that keeping it real and the focus of the convening, Daisha and Isaiah were given 24 hours notice? Yeah, because two of our panelists, they were seniors from Monterey. Some came up, right? That's what happens with adults, but especially with young people, and you gotta go with it, right? So somehow, miraculously, Pixie was able to we worked together and got Daisha and Isaiah to come and join us in 24 hours notice. Just had to give a shout out for that type of work and the reality that things change and you got to go with it. And next to Daisha is a wonderful woman, Amaya, who I want to mention because she doesn't have lived experience, but she is a peer in high school who did a year-long research project with her Law and Social Justice Academy on research on her homelessness in Oakland Unified School District. So it's important to engage young people with lived experience and expertise, as well as their peers who know that so many young people are on the verge of housing instability and homelessness almost any time in so many of our cities. I'm going to briefly share, there's lots of information on the story map, so I'm going to briefly share a few highlights, 3 highlights, and intended outcomes and impact that we feel came from this convening. Our first objective and core outcome was to mark the moment. Participants came and shared innovation and inspiring initiatives and toolkits that were generated by this unprecedented and enormously impactful funding. Just 2 examples. One example was a middle school who for a number of years in San Francisco has been transforming the school facility at night into a housing shelter. Not just for its own families, but across the city, right? They use the funding to create a toolkit to try to inspire other districts around the state to do this incredible act of service and need for their community. Another favorite project that I love was over in Oakland, where a small high school used a CTE, career and technical education class, to teach physics by having students build tiny homes for young unhoused residents of Oakland, right? Two great examples, rigorous, engaging, right? But also very much connected to what's happening around them. All right, our second core objective and outcome was to was to break the isolation. Again, aligning closely with the goals of the event. We did this through relationship building and deepening connections at every level. Young people are isolated. You heard Paige and Agata talk about who wants to share that you're homeless when you're young, let alone any age, let alone young, right? So to break the isolation, to understand the needs and experiences of our students. But everyone else is isolated in this system too. The liaisons who are dealing with crazy caseloads are isolated. Teachers who know what's happening with their students but don't understand where to go with that information are isolated, right? And even faculty, colleagues of mine, I'll share, as you can see here, a quarter of participants at this convening that we had were faculty and researchers. Guess how many of them had never heard of McKinney-Bento? They're experts on trauma, experts on so many things that we're dealing with, right? But not really knowing these nuances that drive a lot of our work here today. As you can see in this chart, an amazing community of practice. About a third of the participants were from districts. As I shared, around a quarter from higher ed, research, totally new to this topic. Community organizations, we had a great contingency from County Office of Ed, I know also represented here today, CDE foundations and young people. I love that you have the youth engagement on Sunday because we had it on Friday and it's hard to get young people, right? We try to keep them in school, but we did have a great contingency. So that was our diverse community of practice, right? I also want to share that one piece of data that is on the website, the state website, and dashboard, because it also illustrated how important data is to use visually to explain phenomenon that we just don't want to acknowledge. Here you can see, as you can see here in California, the vast majority of extremely low-income households offering teetering on the verge of losing their homes, right, pay more than half of their income on rent and utilities. Now, this is a wonderful interactive map, so another plug to go to the website, but just look at the percentage of Greater Sacramento, right? 94% of extremely low-income families pay more than half of their income on rent and utilities. Imagine how hard it is to manage your family and try to, have a robust experience for all of the family members, educational experience, when you're so struggling just to meet most basic needs. Right? So this type of data is important to ground all aspects of the work that we're working with, especially housing, transportation, and other dimensions of the life inside and outside of school. I'll now turn to our third outcome and perhaps most important goal, catalyzing a transformed future. By the end of our convening, participants laid out a range of paths forward, both individually and collectively. Just a few of these important next steps, and are also mentioned on the website story map, included bringing student homelessness to superintendent agendas and school board members. It was amazing that one of the biggest outcomes for the CDE, California Department of Education, homeless education team, was that there were actually superintendents in the room. One of the leaders had worked in homelessness for 22 years and never met with a superintendent. So they felt honored for the first time having those leaders at the table. Working to improve overall academic expectations for our students, beyond just getting a diploma with fewer credits needed. Creating better academic pathways that consider the impact of students' high levels of mobility and instability. Not a problem, but something to work with, not around. Finding ways for all local leaders and superintendents to become champions of this work. And finally, something I know we all agree on, and hopefully we all agree on in this room, bringing young people to the table and to policymaking circles, but preparing them to be there, to engage critically and thoughtfully in the work. We're so good at inviting young people to tables, but how good are we at really preparing them to feel like they have a sense of agency, right? And our peers to the adults with lots of data that we like to throw around, right? So it's really important to prepare the young people, not just invite them to the table. We at the Center for Cities and Schools, which is the center I work at Berkeley. I don't think I introduced myself in talking about that. It's an interdisciplinary action research center, which centers a lot of our work today on this topic. The center, and in partnership with our amazing colleagues here today, are committed to sustaining the work of this amazing Homeless Education Data Committee and Working Group, and are already beginning to work on a California playbook to capture many of the lessons learned these past 3 years and help translate them into direct, actionable steps for students experiencing homelessness and our systems, as well as all similar vulnerable populations. You can read more about the details of this work around stakeholders on our website, and I'm going to do a very quick little tour here. We talked about some actions for the future. All the speakers and their presentations can be found on the website. We have some images. Linda also spoke, as she did yesterday. The video you just saw is also on the website, and quotes, slide decks. I'm going to conclude with Paige. I love this quote that he shared. It takes courage to listen to young people because they will tell you the truth. And I think we all agree to that. I will conclude now recognizing that we are at a critical juncture. While districts are already coming to us in fear of how to sustain their work after losing the $100 million, we are now getting calls from districts and colleagues in the field about fear that we may lose the entire McKinney-Bento federal program with the new administration. Fortunately, here to tell us about a very important and hopeful next step led by the National Center of Youth Law is Paige Clark.
Hello, friends. Paige Clark with the National Center for Youth Law. In our last couple minutes, we wanted to share what did we do with all this data. So we know that our topic today is around information sharing, but we also translated that into action. So while the data committee is a neutral body, the National Center for Youth Law is able to do the advocacy work. And I will say, we heard Maisha earlier emphasize the state does not have money. So we're not asking for $100 million, although that is the amount of funding that that recently expired with the end of the American Rescue Plan Act. But what we realized through our research these past couple years in our work with the data committee is, as Pixie mentioned, folks doing the really important work with students experiencing homelessness have such limited time throughout the week to do that role. And McKinney-Vento, the federal law, has many rights and protections that it outlines for students experiencing homelessness. And if the staff that's uniquely trained and dedicated to doing that work only has 8 hours or less a week to do it, we really can't ask liaisons to do any additional work unless we're funding it in a sustainable way. So as was mentioned earlier, California receives about $13 or $14 million annually to implement McKinney-Vento. We don't know what the next 4 years will look like with federal funding, so it's more important now than ever to ensure that within California we have a funding stream dedicated to students experiencing homelessness. And another prong of that strategy, in addition to requesting additional money, is reducing administrative barriers to allow folks to better access the money that is already out there, right? So how do we ensure that funding streams are complementing each other, that allowable uses for each funding source make sense, right? You know, we know a lot of work goes into figuring out which funding sources allow for staff time, which can we buy equipment with, which can go to training or PD for those working with students experiencing homelessness. So that's another prong of our approach, is to ensure that in every space possible, we're reducing the barriers for folks doing this work to allow folks more time to spend with students, really ensuring that they get what they need and what they have been asking us for. So We first introduced a funding request in spring 2024. As you know, that was not the year to ask for new money from the state of California. But we introduced it anyway because, especially with American Rescue Plan Act money sunsetting, we knew that folks are getting laid off. The few folks in districts or county offices working, really like doing the deep work on creating a better system for students experiencing homelessness, are being, their funding is being reduced. What little funding there was going away. Programs were shutting down. So we felt it was important to put it forward, even if it meant a multi-year effort. So we spent the year lobbying. We had a lobby day. We had 10 County Office of Education representatives come to Sacramento, share testimony during a budget committee. We had many district folks. Of course, we work with students on figuring out what has worked in their educational experience, what do they need more of, what's not working for them. So we had all these conversations throughout the year, and we're getting ready to reintroduce, when the legislature reconvenes in a few weeks here, reintroduce this effort, both the funding requests that we know we need to truly sustain the work and the low-cost option, depending on what that fiscal outlook looks like, where is there funding that can be better utilized, better streamlined? Where are there regulations that are not working for the people doing this work? And how can we reduce those barriers? So I know we're right at time. My email is on one of these slides, and would love to hear from you all. If you have feedback, we want to ensure that the proposal we're putting forward best meets the needs of the field and, of course, our students and families. So we're in early stages, and we'll share more as the work progresses. And I'm going to pass it back to Pixie just for one closing note.
So what do we do with all this information, right? We said that we're all coming from different places. And so this final assumption that might sit in us is that the people and the power to address all of this are a different table above my pay grade, right? Coming from lived expertise and then running programs to then looking at data, being on an advisory board, then an executive of that advisory board. Nobody ever thinks that they're in the room in the decision making. So I'm going to empower you to kick the adultism away and sit in your inner toddler and ask why. You have the power to right where you're situated right now. So ask why, implement things that you've heard this week in your spaces, because it will trickle up, right?